The villainess, watching from afar, saw the scene unfold, the lion, not a monster but a guardian, freeing the elderly woman. Terror froze her veins. She ran, terrified, panic driving her steps, but the forest, which she had used for her wickedness, now turned against her. In her desperate escape, the rich woman didn't see the hidden trap. A scream cut through the air as she fell. Caught. Justice, wild and relentless, had arrived. From there, her path was singular, straight to prison, where the cold of the cell would be a mirror of her own heart. The scream cut through the dense forest air, a sharp, desperate sound that echoed among the ancient trees. It wasn't a cry of anger nor of surprise, but of pure terror, terrified by the abrupt fall. The ground, which seconds before had seemed firm, gave way beneath the rich woman's feet, swallowing her into an unexpected abyss. She plummeted, her body hitting the damp earth walls, dry branches and exposed roots, scratching her skin and tearing her expensive clothes. The final impact was brutal, a dull thud that left her breathless, the taste of dirt and blood in her mouth. She was trapped. The trap, masterfully camouflaged by the very forest she thought she dominated, was a deep, dark pit, its walls steep and slippery, impossible to climb. The air at the bottom was heavy, dense, smelling of mold and decomposition. The panic that had already driven her escape now multiplied, transforming into claustrophobia and despair. Her wide eyes tried to pierce the darkness above, but only found the small circle of night sky, dotted with indifferent stars. Up above, she knew, life went on. Up above, the albino lion, the unlikely guardian, had completed its miracle. The image of the animal digging with controlled fury, earth flying, the elderly woman being freed from her makeshift grave, etched itself into her mind like a vivid nightmare. It wasn't a monster, but a wild angel, and this inversion of the natural order of things was what terrified her most. The forest, silent witness to her cruelty, now imprisoned her, and the universe seemed to conspire for her to feel every ounce of her own venom. As she struggled, the searing pain in her left ankle reminded her of the physical reality of her situation. There was no escape. Her fingers clawed at the damp earth, seeking support, but only found mud and debris. The luxury of her former life, hands accustomed to silks and jewels, were now dirty, wounded, and useless. Wealth, power, influence, none of it could pull her out of that hole. She was just a woman, vulnerable and alone, at the mercy of the night and the forest. Hours dragged on, each minute an eternity of cold and fear. The distant howl of a coyote made her heart race. Forest sounds, once mere background noise, were now palpable threats. She imagined the lion, the guardian, perhaps still nearby, watching her, feeling justice being served. Shame and fury mingled with terror. How had she, a woman of such importance, come to this? It was the sound of human voices that finally broke the monotony of her despair. Distant at first, then closer, accompanied by the rustling of leaves and the snapping of branches. A strong, flickering light danced in the darkness above. She tried to scream, but her voice was hoarse, weak. She coughed, and the muffled sound rose from the pit. "Is anyone there?" a masculine voice asked, deep and authoritative. She gathered all her strength. "Yes, I'm here, help me." The beam of a powerful flashlight descended, sweeping the bottom of the pit and revealing her pale, dirty face, her eyes bloodshot. Two uniformed figures, forest rangers or perhaps police officers, looked down, their expressions a mixture of surprise and concern. "Ma'am, are you all right? How did you end up down there?" asked the second man, his voice softer. She tried to compose herself, the old mask of superiority instinctively returning. I fell. I need help. I am Mrs. Almeida. Don't you know who I am?" One of the men exchanged a glance with the other. "Yes, we do, Mrs. Almeida. We were looking for you. And for someone else, too." The mention of someone else sent a shiver down her spine, colder than the night air. They knew everything. The rescue was slow and humiliating. Ropes were lowered, and she, with her ankle throbbing and body aching, had to be hoisted out of the hole, each pull an agony. When she finally reached the surface, the flashlight's beam revealed not only the two men, but also a police car and an ambulance parked a short distance away. The sound of sirens, now silenced, still seemed to echo in her ears. The forest seemed colder than ever, the air biting. The eyes of the police officers and paramedics awaiting her held no pity, only a cold assessment. The mask of dignity she tried to maintain crumbled completely when one of the officers approached, handcuffs in hand. "Mrs. Almeida, you are under arrest on suspicion of attempted murder and kidnapping. Anything you say can and will be used against you." The words fell upon her like stones, crushing any lingering hope. Reality, brutal and relentless, hit her full force. It wasn't a nightmare from which she would wake in her silk bed. It was the end. The cold handcuffs on her wrists were the final seal. The path to prison, which she thought was just a distant threat, now opened before her, a dark, irreversible tunnel. Justice, wild and relentless, had arrived, and its cold would be but a mirror of her own heart. The cold handcuffs on her wrists were the final seal, but the true imprisonment began long before the bars. It began the moment Mrs. Almeida was pushed into the back seat of a police car, the smell of old upholstery and cheap disinfectant replacing the perfume of her clothes and the aroma of her well-kept gardens. The door slammed shut with a dry, final sound, isolating her from the outside world, from the forest that had betrayed her, and from the albino lion that had sealed her fate. The police car, a utilitarian and unluxurious model, was a stark contrast to the vehicles in her private fleet. Each bump on the dirt road, each sharp turn, sent waves of pain through her injured ankle and bruised body. She tried to maintain composure, the old mask of superiority still struggling to hold, but it was useless. Her eyes, once haughty, now swept the Spartan interior of the car, searching for something familiar, something that connected her to her old life. There was nothing, only the dark window glass, reflecting a pale, dirty face, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The silence inside the car was heavy, punctuated only by the rustling of the forest outside and the police radio, which occasionally crackled with distant, unintelligible voices. The two officers in the front seats did not exchange a word with her. Their gazes, when they met in the rearview mirror, were cold, professional, devoid of any emotion other than that of performing their duty. They did not see Mrs. Almeida, the rich and influential woman. They saw only a suspect, a criminal, and that for her was the greatest humiliation. With every meter, the car advanced. The forest seemed to recede, taking with it the darkness and mystery, but not the terror. The terror was now inside her, a parasite gnawing at her soul. She thought of the elderly woman, the old woman she had condemned to a slow, suffocating death. The image of the lion, the unlikely guardian, digging with controlled fury to free her, etched itself into her mind like a vivid nightmare. It wasn't a monster, but a wild angel, and this inversion of the natural order of things was what terrified her most. Justice, she realized with a chill, was not blind. It had claws and teeth and a roar that echoed in her conscience. Soon, the city lights appeared on the horizon, a promise of civilization that for her now meant only the end. The car stopped in front of an austere, windowless building. The police station. The night air, once laden with the smell of earth and leaves, now had the metallic scent of the city, mixed with the smell of disinfectant and bureaucracy. Entering the police station was a blur of fluorescent lights and indifferent faces. Her handcuffs were removed only for her fingerprints to be taken, her photos snapped, front, profile, with the prison number hanging around her neck. Each step of the process was a new layer of stripping away, taking from her not only her freedom, but her dignity, her identity. Her personal belongings, once so valuable, were catalogued and placed in a plastic bag. The diamond-studded wristwatch, the pearl earrings, the leather wallet with her credit cards and documents. None of it had value there. None of it would protect her. The pain in her ankle was constant, but the pain in her soul was far worse. She was led to an interrogation room, a cold, windowless cubicle with a metal table and 2 chairs. The smell of stale coffee and sweat permeated the air. A detective, a man with a tired face and sharp eyes, sat opposite her. "Mrs. Almeida," he began, his voice monotonous, "let's talk about what happened in the forest." She tried to deny, tried to defend herself, tried to use her influence. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was attacked. I fell into a hole. I am a victim." The detective merely smiled, a humorless smile. "We have witnesses, Mrs. Almeida, a very special witness, in fact. And we have the woman you tried to bury alive. She's in the hospital, but she's alive, and she has a story to tell." The mention of the elderly woman, alive, was an electric shock. She thought the old woman would be dead, that her crime would be buried with her. But the forest, the lion, justice, everything had conspired against her. Blood ran cold in her veins. The mask of superiority completely crumbled, revealing the raw, naked terror beneath. Hours dragged on in that cubicle, each question a stab, each answer an implicit confession. She was exhausted, defeated. When the detective finally stood up, the decision had already been made. "Mrs. Almeida, you will be transferred to a temporary cell. Your lawyer will be notified." The words echoed in her mind as she was led down cold corridors lit by fluorescent lamps. The sound of her own footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The luxury of her former life, hands accustomed to silks and jewels, were now dirty, wounded, and useless. Wealth, power, influence. None of it could get her out of there. The metal door opened with a metallic creak, revealing a small, Spartan cell. A concrete bed with a thin mattress, a stainless steel toilet, and a sink. The air was heavy, smelling of disinfectant and despair. The door closed behind her with a dull, final thud, and the sound of the lock clicking into place was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. She was trapped, not just by the bars, but by the web of her own actions. The darkness of the cell was no more frightening than the darkness in her own heart. The cold of the concrete was a mirror of the coldness she had shown the elderly woman. Justice, wild and relentless, had arrived, and the cold of the cell would be but a mirror of her own heart. And there, alone in the darkness, Mrs. Almeida finally understood that the albino lion had not only saved a life, it had unearthed the truth, and with it, her own end. The darkness of the cell was not just the absence of light. It was a heavy, dense mantle that suffocated every remnant of her old life. There, in the relentless cold of the concrete, Mrs. Almeida tried to breathe, but the air seemed thin, permeated with the smell of cheap disinfectant and the silent echo of others' despairs. Her eyes, accustomed to silk blinds and the filtered light of crystal chandeliers, now strained to distinguish shapes in the gloom, each shadow seeming like a lurking monster. She sat on the edge of the concrete bed, the thin mattress offering illusory comfort, almost a cruel joke. Her ankle throbbed, a constant reminder of the fall, the forest, the trap that had led her to this abyss. But the physical pain was a mere scratch compared to the wound in her soul, the humiliation that gnawed at her from within. How had she, Mrs. Almeida, the woman who dictated rules and moved mountains, come to this? The image of the albino lion, majestic and terrible, digging with controlled fury, haunted her thoughts. It wasn't an animal, but a herald, an executor of a justice she never imagined possible. It had not only saved the elderly woman, it had unearthed the truth, and with it, her own end. The irony was a bitter poison. She, who considered herself above everything and everyone, had been brought down by a wild creature and an elderly woman she deemed insignificant. The night dragged on, interminable. Each metallic creak in the depths of the prison, each muffled cough from a neighboring cell, each distant step of a guard, was a reminder of her new reality. There was no longer the comforting silence of her mansion, only the constant oppressive noise of an institution that swallowed her whole. She tried to close her eyes, to seek refuge in sleep, but the scenes repeated in her mind. The elderly woman's pale face, the glint in the lion's eyes, the cold handcuffs on her wrists, the luxury of her former life, hands accustomed to silks and jewels, were now dirty, wounded, and useless. Wealth, power, influence, none of it could get her out of there. The metal door closed with a dull, final thud, and the sound of the lock clicking into place was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. She was trapped, not just by the bars, but by the web of her own actions. The darkness of the cell was no more frightening than the darkness in her own heart. The cold of the concrete was a mirror of the coldness she had shown the elderly woman. When the first pale light of dawn seeped through a small crack in the wall, Mrs. Almeida felt a renewed dread. The day would bring no relief, only the continuation of the torture. Soon, the door opened with a creak, and a metal tray was pushed inside. Watery coffee, dry bread. It was an animal's meal, not a woman of her stature. She looked at the food with revulsion, but hunger, a sensation she rarely experienced, began to gnaw at her stomach. The detective's voice, monotonous and relentless, echoed in her memory. "We have witnesses, Mrs. Almeida. A very special witness, in fact. And we have the woman you tried to bury alive. She's in the hospital, but she's alive, and she has a story to tell." The elderly woman was alive. This revelation was a harder blow than any handcuff. It meant there was no denying, no escaping the truth. The forest, the lion, justice, everything had conspired against her. With each passing minute, reality solidified. It wasn't a nightmare from which she would wake in her silk bed. It was the end. The path to prison, which she thought was just a distant threat, now opened before her. A dark, irreversible tunnel. Justice, wild and relentless, had arrived, and its cold would be but a mirror of her own heart. She stood up, her ankle protesting, and walked to the metal door, running her fingers over the cold bars. On the other side, there was a corridor, other cells, other shattered lives. She was no longer Mrs. Almeida, the rich and influential woman. She was just a prisoner, stripped of everything, confronted with the ugliness of her own actions. The albino lion had not only saved a life, it had unearthed the truth, and with it, her own end. And there, alone in the darkness, she realized that the true prison was not the bars, but the consciousness of her crimes, which would now haunt her forever. And there, alone in the darkness, she realized that the true prison was not the bars, but the consciousness of her crimes, which would now haunt her forever. That consciousness, once a distant whisper, had transformed into a deafening chorus, each note an echo of her cruelty, each melody a lament for the life she had tried to extinguish. The silence of the cell, which should have been a relief after the chaos of the forest and the interrogation, was, in fact, an amplifier. Each beat of her heart seemed to reverberate off the cold walls, a macabre drum marking the rhythm of her fall. Her eyes, accustomed to the opulence and carefully orchestrated beauty of her world, now fixed on a damp stain on the ceiling or the rough texture of the concrete. There were no paintings, no tapestries, no polished gleam of marble, only the rawness of reality, stripped of any adornment, any illusion. The smell of disinfectant, once just an irritating detail, now seemed to permeate her skin, her hair, her clothes, an indelible mark of her new status. Mrs. Almeida's mind, once sharp and calculating, was now a battlefield. Fragmented images danced before her closed eyes, the wrinkled face of the elderly woman, the earth falling on her fragile body, the muffled sound of a moan she had ignored, and, invariably, the image of the albino lion. It was no longer just a wild animal. It was the personification of her era, the guardian of a cosmic justice she never imagined existed. Its golden eyes, once just a fleeting vision, now pursued her, a relentless beacon in the darkness of her guilt. The pain in her ankle, though persistent, was a physical reminder of a much greater pain, an existential pain. She had lost everything, not just freedom, the mansion, the jewels, but something deeper, the illusion of her own invulnerability, the belief that money and power placed her above the laws of men and nature. She, who had always controlled her destiny and the destiny of others, was now controlled by bars, by schedules, by rules she considered beneath her attention. The night dragged on, and with it Mrs. Almeida felt time distort. Hours seemed like days, and each minute was an eternity of regret and terror. She tried to rationalize, tried to find a loophole, a way out, as she always had in her life, but there were no loopholes here. The trap she had set for the elderly woman, the earth she had thrown over the old woman, all of it had turned against her, a perfect trap of her own making. When the sun finally dared to peek through the small crack in the wall, bringing a pale, lifeless light into the cell, Mrs. Almeida felt a chill that did not come from the cold of the concrete. It was the dread of the day beginning, a day that promised more humiliation, more interrogations, more deepening into her nightmare. The watery coffee and dry bread, her first prison meal, were a brutal shock. She, who had chefs at her disposal, who traveled the world in search of the finest delicacies, was now confronted with the most basic and tasteless of sustenance. The initial repulsion gave way to a strange hunger, a hunger she hadn't felt in years, a hunger that reminded her of her own mortality, of her own animality. The detective's voice, grave and monotonous, echoed in her memory. "We have witnesses, Mrs. Almeida. A very special witness, in fact, and we have the woman you tried to bury alive. She's in the hospital, but she's alive, and she has a story to tell." The elderly woman was alive. This was the cruelest truth of all. There was no denying, no hiding. The forest, the lion, justice, everything had conspired against her. With each passing minute, reality solidified, becoming denser, more suffocating. She was no longer Mrs. Almeida, the rich and influential woman. She was just a prisoner, stripped of everything, confronted with the ugliness of her own actions. The albino lion had not only saved a life, it had unearthed the truth, and with it, her own end. And there, alone in the darkness, she realized that the true prison was not the bars, but the consciousness of her crimes, which would now haunt her forever. The cold of the cell, the smell of disinfectant, the bland food, all of it was merely the backdrop for the true torment. The relentless tribunal of her own mind, where the albino lion presided, and the elderly woman, alive and with her story to tell, was the main witness. The path to trial opened, and she knew there would be no escape. Her empire had crumbled, and she was just an insignificant piece in the machinery of justice, awaiting her final verdict. The consciousness, once a distant whisper, had transformed into a deafening chorus, each note an echo of her cruelty, each melody a lament for the life she had tried to extinguish. The silence of the cell, which should have been a relief after the chaos of the forest and the interrogation, was, in fact, an amplifier. Each beat of her heart seemed to reverberate off the cold walls, a macabre drum marking the rhythm of her fall. Her eyes, accustomed to the opulence and carefully orchestrated beauty of her world, now fixed on a damp stain on the ceiling or the rough texture of the concrete. There were no paintings, no tapestries, no polished gleam of marble. Only the rawness of reality, stripped of any adornment, any illusion. The smell of disinfectant, once just an irritating detail, now seemed to permeate her skin, her hair, her clothes, an indelible mark of her new status. Mrs. Almeida's mind, once sharp and calculating, was now a battlefield. Fragmented images danced before her closed eyes, the wrinkled face of the elderly woman, the earth falling on her fragile body, the muffled sound of a moan she had ignored, and invariably the image of the albino lion. It was no longer just a wild animal, it was the personification of her era, the guardian of a cosmic justice she never imagined existed. Its golden eyes, once just a fleeting vision, now pursued her, a relentless beacon in the darkness of her guilt. The pain in her ankle, though persistent, was a physical reminder of a much greater pain, an existential pain. She had lost everything, not just freedom, the mansion, the jewels, but something deeper, the illusion of her own invulnerability, the belief that money and power placed her above the laws of men and nature. She, who had always controlled her destiny and the destiny of others, was now controlled by bars, by schedules, by rules she considered beneath her attention. The night dragged on, and with it Mrs. Almeida felt time distort. Hours seemed like days, and each minute was an eternity of regret and terror. She tried to rationalize, tried to find a loophole, a way out, as she always had in her life, but there were no loopholes here. The trap she had set for the elderly woman, the earth she had thrown over the old woman, all of it had turned against her, a perfect trap of her own making. When the sun finally dared to peek through the small crack in the wall, bringing a pale, lifeless light into the cell, Mrs. Almeida felt a chill that did not come from the cold of the concrete. It was the dread of the day beginning, a day that promised more humiliation, more interrogations, more deepening into her nightmare. The watery coffee and dry bread, her first prison meal, were a brutal shock. She, who had chefs at her disposal, who traveled the world in search of the finest delicacies, now was confronted with the most basic and tasteless of sustenance. The initial repulsion gave way to a strange hunger, a hunger she hadn't felt in years, a hunger that reminded her of her own mortality, of her own animality. The detective's voice, grave and monotonous, echoed in her memory. "We have witnesses, Mrs. Almeida, a very special witness, in fact, and we have the woman you tried to bury alive. She's in the hospital, but she's alive, and she has a story to tell." The elderly woman was alive. This was the cruelest truth of all. There was no denying, no hiding. The forest, the lion, justice, everything had conspired against her. With each passing minute, reality solidified, becoming denser, more suffocating. She was no longer Mrs. Almeida, the rich and influential woman. She was just a prisoner, stripped of everything, confronted with the ugliness of her own actions. The albino lion had not only saved a life, it had unearthed the truth, and with it her own end. And there, alone in the darkness, she realized that the true prison was not the bars, but the consciousness of her crimes, which would now haunt her forever. The cold of the cell, the smell of disinfectant, the bland food, all of it was merely the backdrop for the true torment, the relentless tribunal of her own mind, where the albino lion presided, and the elderly woman, alive and with her story to tell, was the main witness. The path to trial opened, and she knew there would be no escape. Her empire had crumbled, and she was just an insignificant piece in the machinery of justice, awaiting her final verdict. Hours later, or perhaps it was just minutes, time had become irrelevant. The door of her cell creaked open again. This time it wasn't for the food tray. A guard with an impassive face she was already beginning to hate indicated that she should stand up. "Lawyer," he grunted, his voice hoarse and emotionless. Mrs. Almeida's heart leaped. A lawyer, finally a bridge to the outside world, a chance to reverse this farce. She dragged herself up, her ankle throbbing, feeling a flicker of her old arrogance. They couldn't keep her there. She had money, influence. The walk to the visiting room was a grey, oppressive corridor, each step echoing her new insignificance. The room was small, with a metal table and 2 chairs. Sitting there, with an expression of weariness and disillusionment, was Dr. Fonseca, her longtime lawyer, a man she had paid fortunes to solve her most complex problems. But now he looked different. His eyes, once astute and full of confidence, were dull, almost ashamed. "Mrs. Almeida," he began, his voice low without the usual respectful tone, "the situation is grave." He paused, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "The charges are aggravated attempted murder, kidnapping, and concealment of a body. And the testimony of Mrs. Lucia, the elderly woman, is irrefutable. She described everything, every detail, and we have the forensic evidence from the forest, the dirt on your clothes, the marks, and the animal." The mention of the lion made the air thin in the room. Mrs. Almeida felt a chill run down her spine. The animal. What does the animal have to do with this, Fonseca? It's absurd. A lion cannot testify. She tried to laugh, but the sound came out strangled, humorless. Dr. Fonseca stared at her with a seriousness she had never seen. "It's not the lion that testifies, Mrs. Almeida. It's the proof of what it did, the way it dug, the speed, the precision. It's a story that has shocked everyone. The media is in a frenzy. There's no way to suppress this. Your name is in all the headlines, and not in the way you would like." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "And the worst part, Mrs. Almeida, is that the elderly woman is not alone. She has a family, a grandson who is moving heaven and earth to ensure justice is done. He has already hired a team of heavyweight lawyers." Mrs. Almeida's world spun. A grandson? She had underestimated the elderly woman, the insignificant old woman whom she judged to be alone. The humiliation was a blow stronger than any handcuff. Her empire, her reputation, everything was in ruins. "But what about my money, my influence? Can't we resolve this?" Her voice was a thread, desperate. Dr. Fonseca shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Almeida, your money cannot buy this, not this time. The case is of national repercussion. People are furious, and the elderly woman, she is a hero. The albino lion, a miracle. There is no narrative we can construct for your defense that is credible. Public opinion has already condemned you, and the jury. It will be impossible to find one that is not influenced." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with genuine sadness. "I am very sorry, but you are in an unprecedented situation, and pre-trial detention has been ordered without bail. The prosecution is asking for the maximum penalty." Dr. Fonseca's words fell upon her like stones, crushing any lingering hope. There was no way out, no way to buy, bribe, or manipulate. The albino lion, the herald of justice, had sealed her fate. The elderly woman, the victim who refused to die, was now her executioner. And she, Mrs. Almeida, was just a woman in a cold cell, awaiting the inevitable. The tribunal of her mind, where the lion presided, was about to become a much darker reality. Dr. Fonseca's words echoed in the small room, each one a hammer striking the fortress of her arrogance. There was no way out, no way to buy, bribe, or manipulate. Mrs. Almeida felt the air thin, oxygen draining from her lungs like the hope of her freedom. The albino lion, the herald of justice, had sealed her fate. The elderly woman, the victim who refused to die, was now her executioner. And she, Mrs. Almeida, was just a woman in a cold cell, awaiting the inevitable. The tribunal of her mind, where the lion presided, was about to become a much darker reality. The silence that followed the lawyer's departure was even heavier than the bars of her cell. Dr. Fonseca had left with the same expression of defeat, leaving her alone with the naked truth. Money, her shield and sword for a lifetime, had become useless. She, the woman who controlled empires, now controlled not even her own destiny. Humiliation was a slow poison, corroding every fiber of her being. Back in the cell, the smell of disinfectant seemed stronger, the walls colder, the mattress harder. Every detail of that hostile environment was a reminder of her new reality. She tried to lie down, but the pain in her ankle and the agitation in her mind allowed no rest. Her eyes wandered over the ceiling, seeking an escape point, but only found the damp stain that seemed to grow, swallowing her in its darkness. The image of the elderly woman, alive and with her story to tell, was the cruelest of tortures. She had underestimated the old woman, whom she judged insignificant, alone. But the elderly woman had a grandson, a defender, and now the support of an entire nation. The media, once an instrument she manipulated with skill, was now her executioner, painting her as the villain of a perverse fairy tale where the hero was an albino lion and the princess a fragile old woman. The lion. Ah, the lion. It was no longer just a wild beast. In her mind, it had transformed into a relentless judge, its golden eyes observing her every move, every thought. It had dug the earth, not just to save the elderly woman, but to unearth the truth, to expose her cruelty to the world. And the world, thirsty for justice and an extraordinary story, had embraced the narrative of the miracle. Pre-trial detention without bail. The prosecution asking for the maximum penalty. Fonseca's words spun in her head, a mantra of condemnation. She, Mrs. Almeida, who had always lived above the laws, now faced the most severe of them. The irony was brutal. The trap she had set for the elderly woman, the earth she had thrown over the old woman, all of it had turned against her, a perfect trap of her own making. Days dragged on in an agonizing monotony. Each bland meal, each cold shower, each minute of silence was a constant reminder of her fall. She tried to cling to any remnant of her old identity, but the rich, powerful, untouchable Mrs. Almeida had died in the forest, buried under the same earth she tried to use to conceal her crime. Now she was just a number, a prisoner, stripped of everything. The news that arrived, filtered by guards or by brief mentions from the lawyer in his increasingly short and disheartening visits, was always the same. The story of the elderly woman and the albino lion had spread like wildfire. Online petitions called for justice. Support groups for the elderly woman emerged across the country. The old woman's grandson, a determined young man, had become the face of the campaign against her, a symbol of the struggle of the small against the powerful. Mrs. Almeida tried to argue, in her rare conversations with Fonseca, about the irrationality of an animal being part of the proof. "It's an aberration. No one will believe that in a serious court," she insisted, her voice trembling. But the lawyer merely shook his head, his eyes tired. "Mrs. Almeida, the jury is not made up of jurists. It is made up of people, and people love a miracle story. The lion is not a witness. It is the personification of divine intervention, of fate. It is proof that you were not dealing with a helpless old woman, but with something much greater." This was the most terrifying truth of all. She had not just tried to kill a woman, she had challenged something beyond her comprehension, something that nature and, perhaps, the universe had risen to correct. The albino lion was not just an animal. It was a spectre, a guardian, a symbol of her own ruin. Mrs. Almeida's mind, once a labyrinth of strategies and Machiavellian plans, was now a field of wreckage. Thoughts tumbled over each other, fragmented, painful. She saw the elderly woman's face, no longer wrinkled and fragile, but serene and victorious. She saw the lion's golden eyes, no longer wild, but wise and judging. She was trapped, not just between bars, but within her own consciousness, which had become a relentless tribunal with no chance of appeal. The trial approached, and with it, the certainty that there would be no escape. She had lost, not to a human adversary, but to the uncontrollable force of truth, unearthed by an albino lion and witnessed by a woman who refused to die. Mrs. Almeida, the rich and powerful woman, was about to face the final verdict, not just of the law, but of the very life she tried to extinguish. The days that followed that last conversation with Fonseca were a purgatory. Each dawn brought with it not hope, but the countdown to her condemnation. The cell, once a space of confinement, transformed into a chamber of psychological torture. The smell of mold and disinfectant permeated her nostrils. The dim light of the corridor lamp seemed to mock the darkness in her soul. She tried to sleep, but sleep was a denied luxury. When she closed her eyes, she saw the damp earth falling on the elderly woman's face, the expression of terror, then resignation, and then the golden eyes, always the golden eyes of the albino lion, watching her from a place beyond the forest, beyond the prison, beyond reality itself. The lion was no longer a sporadic hallucination. It had become a permanent tenant in her mind, a silent, omnipresent judge. Its roars, which once made her run, were now dull echoes in her memory, a sound that announced the inevitability of her fate. She tossed and turned on the hard mattress, her ankles still throbbing, each physical pain a reminder of the fall that had led her there. Mrs. Almeida, who slept on silk sheets and feather pillows, now clung to a rough blanket, trembling not from cold, but from dread. The news, once filtered, now seemed to invade her cell through the walls, the whispers of guards, the fragments of radio that echoed from some distant room. The story of the elderly woman and the albino lion had transcended mere news to become an urban legend, a modern fairy tale with a real villain. The old woman's grandson, with his choked voice and determined gaze, was the new face of justice, a David against the Goliath she represented. Millions of people, in petitions and demonstrations, clamored for her head, eager to see the rich and untouchable woman finally pay. "It's a circus, a farce," she murmured to the walls, her voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "An animal cannot be evidence. It's irrational." But the echo in her own mind responded with Fonseca's words. People love a miracle story, and the miracle was the lion, the savior, the herald of truth. It had dug not only the earth, but the grave of her reputation, her freedom, her very life. The morning of the trial arrived like a blow. Breakfast, blander than usual, remained untouched. Her hands trembled as she tried to arrange the few remaining strands of hair, a futile gesture of someone trying to maintain dignity amidst disgrace. The prison uniform, grey and shapeless, was the antithesis of her haute couture wardrobe. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror and saw not the Mrs. Almeida she knew, but a pale shadow with sunken eyes and an expression of defeat that aged her decades. The journey to the courthouse was a blur of sirens and flashes. The crowd outside was a sea of angry faces, posters with the image of the lion and the elderly woman, shouts of "Murderer!" and "Justice!" She tried to look away, but the sounds and images infiltrated, hammering her already fragile mind. It was the whole world against her, and the lion, the damned lion, was the symbol of her ruin. Upon entering the courtroom, the air seemed to thin. Glances fixed on her, heavy, judgmental. The jury, 12 pairs of ordinary eyes, but to her they seemed like the golden eyes of the lion, multiplied, watching every movement, every breath. The prosecutor, with a voluminous briefcase, seemed like a herald of her condemnation. She sought Fonseca, who seemed even more aged, his tired expression a mirror of her despair. The trial began. The formalities, the judge's words, everything seemed distant, muffled. But when the prosecutor began to narrate the events, to describe the forest, the grave, the elderly woman, and then the intervention of the albino lion, Mrs. Almeida's voice failed. She felt a chill run down her spine. The story, told in vivid detail, was irrefutable. The evidence, the images of the forest, the grave, the elderly woman's testimony, which would be presented on video due to her fragility, all pointed to her. The lion. It was not physically there, but its presence was overwhelming, more real than any human witness. It was the driving force of the entire accusation, the link between her cruelty and divine justice. Mrs. Almeida felt a knot in her throat, a dizziness. She had lost, not just power, freedom, or fortune. She had lost the battle against something much greater than her, something that nature, fate, or perhaps the universe itself had sent to unearth the truth and seal her end. The verdict, she knew, was already written. The verdict, she knew, was already written. That chilling certainty was not a premonition, but the logical conclusion of a battle lost long before it began. The prosecutor, with his grave and theatrical voice, continued to weave the narrative, transforming facts into an epic saga of good versus evil. He didn't need complex forensic evidence. He had a story, and that story had an albino lion as its unexpected protagonist. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor's voice echoed, filling the heavy silence of the courtroom, "what we have here is not just a heinous crime, but a testament to human resilience and the intervention of forces that transcend our understanding. A woman, octogenarian, buried alive, abandoned to her fate. And then the miracle, a lion, a predator of nature who, instead of taking a life, saved it. It dug, it unearthed the truth, it became the herald of justice." Mrs. Almeida shivered. He was using Fonseca's words, but with a conviction her own lawyer could never replicate. The prosecutor painted the lion not as an animal, but as an emissary, a symbol of a justice greater than human, and the jury, she could feel, was captivated. The 12 pairs of eyes, once merely curious, now gleamed with a mixture of fascination and indignation. They did not see an accused woman. They saw the villain of a tale they had already embraced. Fonseca, beside her, seemed shrunken, his shoulders slumped, his briefcase almost empty. His defense, based on technicalities and the irrationality of a lion as evidence, crumbled under the weight of emotion and popular narrative. In his closing argument, he tried to argue about the lack of precedents, the fragility of animal testimony, the collective hysteria. But his words were like whispers against the roar of the crowd outside, against the clamor of the media, against the very story the prosecutor so skillfully constructed. "There is no concrete evidence linking my client to the animal," Fonseca tried, his voice choked. "There's no way to prove the lion's intent. This is speculation. It's superstition." But the prosecutor smiled, a restrained, almost pitying smile. "The lion's intent, Dr. Fonseca, was to save a life, and the accused's intent, Mrs. Almeida, was to take it. The difference is abysmal. And the evidence? The elderly woman's testimony recorded on video, with the dirt still on her clothes, her voice weak but firm, describing every moment of her terror. The images of the forest, the grave, the trap the accused herself set for herself, and the lion. Ah, the lion. It is not a witness. It is the living evidence that truth always finds a way to light. Mrs. Almeida's mind reeled. The elderly woman, that insignificant old woman whom she judged to be voiceless, powerless. Now, her voice, amplified by the media and national commotion, was thunder. And the lion. It was lightning. It had unearthed not only the elderly woman, but the very essence of her cruelty, exposing it to the unforgiving sun of justice. Hours dragged on. The jury's deliberation was brief, almost symbolic. There was no doubt, no complexity. The story was simple, direct, and the villain was clear. Mrs. Almeida felt her heart pound in her chest, a disjointed rhythm of dread and resignation. She tried to cling to any thread of hope, but the image of the lion's golden eyes, which had pursued her since the forest, now multiplied in the eyes of every juror, every spectator, every camera lens. When the jury returned, the silence in the courtroom was so dense you could almost touch it. The judge, with a solemn expression, asked for the verdict to be read. Mrs. Almeida closed her eyes for a moment, trying to prepare herself for the final blow. She heard the jury foreman's voice, firm and unwavering. In the case of the prosecution against Mrs. Almeida, each word was a hammer blow, each syllable a nail in her coffin of freedom. She felt the air thin, the world around her becoming a blur. The lion, it had won. It had dug her grave, not with claws and teeth, but with the uncontrollable force of a miracle, of a truth that refused to be buried. We find the defendant, Mrs. Almeida, guilty. The word echoed, reverberated, filling every corner of her mind. Guilty. The sound was final, absolute. There was no appeal to fate, no bail for the condemnation the universe had imposed. She had lost everything, her fortune, her power, her freedom, her identity, and all because of an old woman and an albino lion. The irony was a poison that burned in her veins. She had tried to bury a life, but had unearthed her own ruin. The lion, the guardian of the forest, had become Mrs. Almeida's executioner. The word guilty was not just a sound, it was an earthquake that shook the foundations of her existence. Mrs. Almeida felt the ground vanish beneath her feet, the air thin in her lungs. The murmur that followed in the courtroom was not of surprise, but of a contained satisfaction, a collective relief that hit her like a cold wave. She did not faint, did not scream. She just stood there, petrified, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if trying to cling to a reality that no longer existed. Fonseca, beside her, placed a hesitant hand on her shoulder, but the gesture was useless, empty. He had lost, and his defeat was hers, amplified to infinity. The judge, with his grave and unwavering voice, continued, describing the gravity of the crime, the cruelty of the intent, the impact on the victim and society. Each word was a hammer striking her coffin. Considering the premeditation, the brutality of the act, and the trauma inflicted on the victim, as well as the public outcry for justice, the judge's voice seemed to come from an abyss. Mrs. Almeida could not process the words, only the tone, the weight of the condemnation. She felt the gazes of the jury, the prosecutors, the audience, all converging on her, no longer as a figure of power, but as an object of scorn, an aberration to be expunged. The sentence was pronounced with a solemnity that seemed rehearsed for an epic drama. Mrs. Almeida, this court condemns you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Life imprisonment. The words echoed in her mind, cold, definitive. There was no more escape, no more fortune to buy freedom, no influence to bend the law. The world she knew, the world of luxury, power, and impunity, had been pulverized. She was now just a number, a prisoner, a shadow of what she once was. The journey back to prison was even more torturous. The crowd outside had multiplied, and the shouts of "justice served" and "murderer" were deafening. The camera flashes were like lightning, piercing the darkness of her soul. She cowered in the back seat of the police car, trying to become invisible. But there was nowhere to run. The lion, invisible but omnipresent, seemed to roar in every cry of the crowd, in every flash, in every beat of her heart. Back in the cell, the silence was an even greater weight than the noise. The hard mattress, the rough blanket, the cold walls, everything seemed to mock her old life. She threw herself onto the mattress, tears finally coming hot and bitter. They were not tears of regret, but of anger and despair. Anger at being caught, at being defeated by an animal, by an old woman, by a system she always believed she was above. News of the conviction spread like wildfire. The story of the elderly woman and the albino lion reached mythical proportions. The old woman's grandson, now a national hero, gave interviews. His voice choked, but full of gratitude and relief. The lion, the forest guardian, was celebrated in every corner of the country, its image emblazoned on T-shirts, murals, and solidarity campaigns. Petitions for its protection and veneration multiplied. It was no longer just an animal, it was a symbol of hope that justice sometimes comes from where it is least expected. Mrs. Almeida heard fragments of this news through the guards, the whispers of other inmates, the headlines of newspapers that sometimes reached the prison. Each mention of the lion was a stab, a constant reminder of her humiliation. It had become her tormentor, the herald of her disgrace. She tried to argue with Fonseca on his last visit before he withdrew, exhausted and defeated. Is there no appeal, no loophole, a procedural error? Fonseca shook his head, his eyes tired. Mrs. Almeida, the case is solid. The elderly woman's testimony, the forensic evidence from the grave, the trap, and the lion, it has become the personification of truth. No jury in the world would ignore that narrative. The appeal would be useless. You were condemned by public opinion even before you entered the courtroom. Those words were the final nail. Condemned by public opinion, condemned by the lion. She had underestimated the power of a story, the power of a miracle. She had scoffed at nature, and nature, in its wildest and most unexpected form, had exacted its revenge. The days in prison dragged on, monotonous and cruel. The luxury of her past life was now a distant memory, almost unreal. Haute couture clothes were replaced by a grey, rough uniform, gourmet meals by bland and repetitive food, the soft bed by a hard cot. But the worst torture was not physical, it was mental. The image of the lion with its golden eyes and white fur pursued her incessantly. It was the guardian of her nightmares, the constant reminder of her fall. She tried to sleep, but the silent roar of the lion echoed in her mind, mingling with the shouts of the crowd, with the judge's words, with the sound of the earth being dug. It had dug her grave, not in the forest, but in prison, in the darkness of her own mind. Mrs. Almeida, once the queen of her empire, was now a prisoner, stripped of everything, except her bitter memories and the certainty that the albino lion, the unlikely savior, had been the instrument of her ruin. And in each grey dawn, she knew that the sun would no longer rise for her, only to illuminate the legend of the lion that saved the elderly woman and unearthed the truth. Justice, after all, had claws, and they were the claws of an albino lion. The metallic clang of the cell closing was the most definitive sound Mrs. Almeida had ever heard. It wasn't the soft click of a luxury car door, nor the comforting silence of her mansion. It was a dry thud, a seal of condemnation that echoed not only off the cold walls, but through every fiber of her being. The air, once thin in the courtroom, now felt dense and heavy, laden with the smell of mold, cheap disinfectant, and despair. She was there, finally. There were no more lawyers, no appeals, no fleeting glimmer of hope. Prison was her new reality, and the albino lion, her perpetual shadow. Days dragged on in cruel monotony. The sun, which once kissed her skin on paradise beaches, now filtered through a small barred window, a pale, indifferent beam that barely touched the floor. Hours were marked by the jingle of guards' keys, the distant murmur of other voices, the bland sound of meals served on metal trays. Every detail was a torture, a vivid reminder of the abyss between her past and her present. The grey, rough uniform scratched her skin, a constant affront to the silks and cashmeres that adorned her wardrobe. The food, tasteless and soulless, was a mockery of the banquets she used to command. But the worst torture was not physical, it was her mind, a battlefield where memories clashed with brutal reality. The image of the lion, with its golden eyes and immaculate white fur, had become the guardian of her nightmares, the tormentor of her waking hours. It didn't need to be physically present to torment her. Its silent roar echoed in her head, mingling with the shouts of the crowd, with the judge's words, with the sound of the earth being dug. It had dug her grave, not in the forest, but in prison, in the darkness of her own mind. She tried to sleep, but sleep was a denied luxury. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scene repeat, the grave, the elderly woman, the terror in her eyes. And then, the white flash, the unstoppable force of claws, unearthing not just the old woman, but the very essence of her cruelty. And the run, the desperate dash through the forest, the icy fear of being hunted, the fall into the trap she herself had set. The irony was a poison that burned in her veins. She had tried to bury a life, but had unearthed her own ruin. News from the outside world, filtered by talkative guards or by fragments of old newspapers, were more stabs. The albino lion, the forest guardian, had become a living legend, its image emblazoned on T-shirts, murals, and solidarity campaigns. Petitions for its protection and veneration multiplied. It was no longer just an animal, it was a symbol of hope, that justice sometimes comes from where it is least expected. Each mention of its name was a hammer blow, a constant reminder of her humiliation. It had become her tormentor, the herald of her disgrace. Months turned into a year, then another. The mirror in her cell showed an aged woman, with sunken eyes and a permanent expression of bitterness. The wrinkles were not of wisdom, but of contained despair. Her hair, once impeccably styled, was now thin and lifeless. She had lost her identity, her power, her beauty. She was just Mrs. Almeida, the woman the lion had defeated. The elderly woman, she learned from a guard, had fully recovered. Her story was told and retold, a testament to human resilience and the miracle of nature. The old woman's grandson, now a national hero, continued to give interviews, his voice choked but full of gratitude and relief. Their lives had been transformed for the better, while hers had been pulverized. In each grey dawn, Mrs. Almeida knew that the sun would no longer rise for her, only to illuminate the legend of the lion that saved the elderly woman and unearthed the truth. Justice, after all, had claws. And they were the claws of an albino lion, which, though invisible, continued to dig day after day the grave of her soul. It had not only condemned her to life imprisonment, it had condemned her to an eternity of torment, a private hell where the roar of a lion was the only melody. In each grey dawn, Mrs. Almeida knew that the sun would no longer rise for her, only to illuminate the legend of the lion that saved the elderly woman and unearthed the truth. Justice, after all, had claws, and they were the claws of an albino lion, which, though invisible, continued to dig, day after day, the grave of her soul. It had not only condemned her to life imprisonment, it had condemned her to an eternity of torment. A private hell where the roar of a lion was the only melody. She clung to anger, a cold flame that kept her from completely collapsing. Anger at being caught, at being defeated by an animal, by an insignificant old woman, by a system she always believed she was above. There was no regret, only an impotent fury against the fate that had betrayed her. Months turned into a year, then another. The mirror in her cell showed an aged woman with sunken eyes and a permanent expression of bitterness. The wrinkles were not of wisdom, but of contained despair. Her hair, once impeccably styled, was now thin and lifeless. She had lost her identity, her power, her beauty. She was just Mrs. Almeida, the woman the lion had defeated. The anger, which was once a fortress, began to erode, giving way to a deep exhaustion. It was not the exhaustion of physical labor, but that of the spirit, which incessantly fought against the invisible walls of her own mind. The nights, long and cold, were filled not only with visions of the lion, but with a deafening emptiness. The silence of the cell, once punctuated by her own furious thoughts, now became an echo of her insignificance. She, who always commanded, was now commanded. She, who always had, now possessed nothing, not even the peace of dreamless sleep. The guards, once mere shadows, began to personify the indifference of the world. Their gazes, their monotonous voices, the jingle of their keys, everything was a reminder of her new position in the hierarchy of life. She tried to evoke the arrogance of her past, the posture of someone above it all, but the words died in her throat, and the mirror in her cell revealed only a pathetic shadow of the woman she once was. The elderly woman, the old woman she considered a nuisance, had become a beacon of hope for millions. Her grandson, a hero, and the lion. The lion was a god. Mrs. Almeida was the sacrifice on the altar of this new faith. The irony was no longer a burning poison, it was an acid that slowly dissolved every trace of her old identity. She was no longer the rich, the influential, the feared woman. She was the villain of the story, the antagonist of a modern fairy tale, eternally linked to her white-furred savior. On a particularly grey day, as she watched the pale beam of sunlight struggle to penetrate the bars, a new sensation washed over her. It was not anger nor despair, but a cold, empty acceptance. The lion no longer needed to dig into her soul. It had already finished its work. She was empty, stripped of everything, even the capacity to feel the fury that kept her standing. The torment was no longer active but passive, a condemnation to inertia, to the perpetual contemplation of her own ruin. The lion's roar, once a cry of terror, was now just a distant whisper, the final sound of a door closing forever. Justice, with its sharp claws, had fulfilled its promise. Justice, with its sharp claws, had fulfilled its promise. And Mrs. Almeida, the woman who once judged herself above all laws, now lived the promise of her own ruin. The cold, empty acceptance that had washed over her was not a balm, but a slow-acting poison, corroding what remained of her soul. It was not peace, but a forced surrender, the capitulation of a spirit that, though it refused repentance, no longer had the strength to fight against the truth that imprisoned her. The days succeeded one another, indistinguishable, the grey of the uniform, the grey of the walls, the grey of the sky seen through the bars. Everything merged into a monotonous palette that mirrored the emptiness within her. She no longer clung to anger. Anger had drained away, taking with it the last spark of her old identity. Now, there was only absence. The absence of power, of luxury, of respect. The absence of a future. The absence of herself. The lion's roar, that distant whisper that marked the end of her struggle, became a constant hum in the back of her consciousness. It was not a sound of terror, but a memory, a perennial echo of that day in the forest. The image of the albino lion, once a vivid nightmare that tore her from sleep, transformed into a cold, distant icon, seared into her mind. It no longer needed to dig the earth. It had dug an abyss in her existence, and she was irremediably trapped in it, with no hope of climbing out. News from the outside world, when it arrived, was merely a cruel reinforcement of her defeat. The elderly woman, with her unwavering dignity and resilience, lived out her final years in peace, surrounded by love and gratitude, living proof that goodness, sometimes, triumphs over the most calculating malice. Her grandson, once an ordinary young man, was now a symbol of gratitude and hope, his voice echoing the story of the miracle. And the albino lion, the forest guardian, transcended mere animal existence to become a legend that inspired millions, a beacon of wild and unexpected justice. Mrs. Almeida was the shadow, the antithesis of all this. Her story would be told, yes, but as a cautionary tale, a dark echo of the arrogance and cruelty that led her to ruin. She was the villain eternally linked to the white-furred hero, the dark stain on the canvas of a redemption that was not hers. Her reflection in the polished metal of her tray or in the misty glass of the small window showed a woman she barely recognized. Her eyes, once full of fire and ruthless ambition, were now pools of resignation, empty of any sparkle. Her hair, once a symbol of status and power, was now a thin, lifeless tangle, as grey as the future that awaited her. She was the empty shell of a life that had been devoured by the very darkness she cultivated, a ghost of her opulent past. Justice, with its claws, had not only physically imprisoned her, it had deconstructed her piece by piece until nothing remained of the Mrs. Almeida she once was. Prison was merely the setting. The true captivity was within her, a cell forged by the memory of the albino lion, the deafening silence of the earth being dug, and the mute cry of an old woman she tried to erase from existence. And in that internal captivity she would remain, a statue of bitterness and emptiness, until the end of her days. The lion had won, the elderly woman had won, justice had won. And Mrs. Almeida, the woman who dared to play God and bury a life, had been reduced to dust, dust so insignificant that not even the forest wind, which once witnessed her crime, would dare to carry it. The distant roar of the lion now was the epitaph of her soul,